Okay, so the Trump administration came to the conclusion, the first one, and the second one is doing the same. They came to the conclusion that the idea of building a mass opposition within the island did not work. There were discontent people in Cuba. You would be if you were suffering, scarcity, blackouts, and all the rest of it, which is a result of the blockade. But they're not prepared. The majority of the population, I think a vast majority of the population in Cuba, are not prepared to go over to the other side, as it has happened in some other places. One of the mechanisms, and particularly the youth has found, which is a manifestation of the crisis, or the crisis induced and provoked by the United States, is the number of people who actually left the island in the last period. The figures are all over the place in terms of, precision. Nevertheless, it's between 1 to 2 million people, apparently, that have left. I think 2 million is too much, but 1 million is a lot. 2 million is too much in terms of thinking that they left. And 1 million perhaps is closer to the mark. The issue is this. What the United States that asphyxiates the economy and then makes it easy for people to come to the United States illegally. And then they give them green cards and all the rest of it. So this is deliberate. And I think the plan now was to bring as many of them as possible into the United States and then expel them so that when they went back, there would be a mass group ready to do whatever it was. And that's why, this persecution of Latinos in the United States, and this is part of it. It's not the only reason, but this is part of this. So the idea now is to make the thing collapse and drive people to despair as much as possible. And they're really squeezing the economy so hard. At the AGM, we discussed some of the things that they are doing. For example, they restore, although Biden took Cuba out of the list of states sponsoring terrorism, in the last week of his administration. And they knew very well that, the Trump administration was going to put Cuba back on the same list, and he did it 1 week later. So Biden took Cuba off the list of states sponsoring terrorism on the 7th of January, 2024, and Trump restored Cuba into that list on the 14th of January. Cuba was out of this list of states sponsoring terrorism only for 1 week. It's a game. The Democrats pretend that they are reasonable and they're not, and they apply the same policies, though they're less crass about it. What it means is this: no company in the world, no bank, no financial institution is going to get itself involved with Cuba in any transaction of any kind, because it will be aiding, this will be the technical legal term, will be aiding and abetting a state that sponsors terrorism, and therefore is liable to be sanctioned massively by the United States. And if you're a company that operates in the market, you're a capitalist company, the last thing you want is to be sanctioned and punished in the US market. So the consequence of Cuba being on the list of states sponsored terrorism, which is a complete lie, obviously it's completely false, has been absolutely devastating. That's number one. And that's been going on for a while, for several years now. This is really problematical. And it's quite difficult to persuade anybody. And if there were to be a company that is prepared to deal with Cuba, taking the risk, they will charge the earth for a loan, rather than charging you the normal, 2%, 3%, 4% loans that, charge the ordinary banks and financial institutions. They will charge you 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. If somebody is going to sell you stuff, rice, beans, whatever it is that Cuba needs to import in order to ensure that they have plenty of resources in the island, then those who are prepared to trade with Cuba will charge much, much more for those exports and so on. So everything is extremely difficult. And if Cuba needs medicine, which it does, of course, needs to import, it doesn't produce anything, The same pharmaceutical companies will be through intermediaries or mediators or God knows who, mavericks in the world market that will charge the earth. So the situation deliberately made it very difficult by this one. So our campaign to campaign that Cuba should not be on the list and give people of public influence to make the same point is absolutely crucial in terms of solidarity. That's number one. Then number two, the Trump administration enabled the Title III of the Helms-Burton Law. The Helms-Burton Law was passed by George W. Bush at the time, and the idea was to make the economy crack. That is to say, to apply such level of sanctions against Cuba that Cuba would not survive. And Title III will allow U.S. citizens as well as Cubans that be naturalized U.S. citizens to actually enter into litigations against the Cuban state for the expropriations that the Cuban Revolution carried out back in 1959, 1962-65, which are literally all of the companies, not one, the whole lot was actually expropriated by the Cuban Revolution. To expropriate multinational companies or companies as a matter of national necessity is legal, and it is consecrated in the United Nations Charter. So it's not like Cuba acted illegally. And ever since those expropriations, Cuba had been trying to negotiate with the United States to say, let's settle this matter for once and for all so there is normality amongst us. And of course, the United States refused. So to open that door to say, enter into litigation, you can imagine judges in Texas or I don't know, I don't want to name any bad state in the United States. I think most of them are. But judges will sort of facilitate this litigation. It will be taken into international court. Sanctions will be applied to companies. You can imagine the consequence will be terrible. It will be on top of everything else. The third thing is that the Trump administration took the measure to restrict the sending of remittances by Cubans living in the United States to Cuba. And Cuba was getting in the region of $2.5, $2.3 billion a year, which is quite a lot. And then it began to decline drastically as a result of this decision taken by the Trump administration. They stopped the Western Union. They punished one Cuban company, Orbit, that was operating to actually send the remittances, process them through the financial system. And given that the dollar is done or is processed internationally in transactions through the SWIFT system, then the United States controls it. So it can't really stop it. And these resources which were coming in every year from families to families, nothing to do with state, they're declining quite significantly. Then the United States took the decision to actually take the special legal protection that Cubans that arrive to the United States illegally in the last period particularly, which applied to something like 900,000 Cubans. That's what I'm saying. It's about 1 million that left. When you're Cuban and escape in inverted commas communism and you arrive to the United States, you're immediately welcome. And you're given a status right away, a state of asylum seeker. And you get a special protection, which means you're entitled to work, you can have your national security number and so on. And you can even claim some benefit. The Trump administration decided to take that away. And then all these people can be expelled. And given the raids, anti-immigration raids that the Trump administration is organizing the whole country, these people are really in dire straits. Not only they cannot make money, not only they cannot work necessarily, many of them have tremendous problems. We do not know how many of them have been arrested, not too many yet. But their position is impossible. Cuba doesn't have the resources such as Venezuela has, which is able to send planes to bring people back. Cuba doesn't have the resources. So it creates an impossible situation. So it creates discontent of Cubans to the point of hatred in Miami and in the United States and their relatives over in Cuba. And also, you can imagine how unpleasant it must be. So they are, going for everything. And I think the worst one of them all, in terms of being the most threatening one, although all the other ones are devastating economically, is the reports and the position being taken by the Pentagon, the Southern Command. The commander-in-chief used to be a general, a woman called Laura Richardson, who made the same point.
Yeah.
And then the new one is a guy called an admiral from the Navy called Admiral Alvin Hosley, who normally the commander-in-chief of the Southern Command makes a presentation to the Senate Armed Services Committee to say what they're thinking, what they're doing, and so on in terms of, the United States policy on the hemisphere, on Latin America, basically. And the argument is this. It was the argument by Laura Richardson, is the argument by Hosley, and is the argument by the Southern Command, and is the position of the United States. China, Russia, and Iran are intervening illegally and acceptably in the hemisphere which belongs to the United States. They don't say belong, but that's what they mean. And therefore, they will not contemplate and they will not tolerate that any country in Latin America were to enter into any deals with these countries that, as far as the US is concerned, the way they present it, they represent an existential threat. So the argument of the defense of the United States has been framed in such a way that Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, they are mentioned, those three, are really the conduits through which these existential threats represented by China, Russia, and Iran are actually intervening in the hemisphere. So it's really worrying. And that's why in the resolution we passed, the emergency resolution that we passed at this Cuba Solidarity Campaign AGM, we said we cannot rule out the possibility of military action by the United States. So, in other words, the situation is really, really bad. And the structure of the Cuban economy can come back, because I want to end with a positive note, which is not invented, it's real. The Cuban economy is organized in the following way. The services sector, that is to say tourism and services in general, represents 75% of GDP. Huge. Industry represents only 24%, and agriculture represents 8%. That is to say, the Cubans cannot produce sufficient food to feed themselves. That's really what it means. I mean, they have services which they need to use, but they don't have enough money to use them. And they have tourism, and of course, they don't have enough food to actually service it, which is very problematical. And the agricultural sector in Cuba, which is being undergoing significant transformation ever since the collapse of the USSR and what they call cooperativization of the sugar industry, where they set up cooperatives that became in charge of, significant tracts of land to produce onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and so on. Yucca, which is one of the best potatoes they have. But they don't produce enough. So therefore, when you have scarcity of product, the prices go up. And on top of that, those cooperatives have been using the market, and they've been using the difficulties, the scarcity, to actually inflate the prices deliberately, which is sort of, I would call it, natural reaction of traders. The moment they see an opportunity, they will charge you more because, they have the product and you need it. So therefore, Cuba actually suffered some significant inflation. So imagine an economy which has been contracting, an economy which is getting less tourists, from 4.7 to now in 2024, Cuba received only 2.2 million tourists. That is to say, less than half of the best year. That is to say, they receive half of the income. And when you say this many tourists, it doesn't mean to say they stay as long as the period when it was good. When it was 4.7 million, these people will stay 10 days, 12 days. When it is bad, people go to Cuba, say only 2 million, but they stay for 3-4 days. In other words, the income that the country receives not only declines because of the number of tourists, but because of the number of days that people are there. So everything is really bad from that point of view. And the overall performance of the economy, because of all these complications which I try to describe, the average rate of growth of Cuba is in the region of 1%. And that's been slightly generous. And then the value of the currency as a consequence of this weakening of the economy loses value. That is to say, there was a moment when the Cuban peso was the same to $1. Then there was the special Cuban peso, the cook, that was also $1. Now the exchange rate is in the region of 86. That is to say, you need 86 pesos for $1. That is to say, the purchasing power of the masses has declined also on top of everything else. So you can imagine the United States is doing a really horrible job to ensure that there is a maximum social discontent and so on. And everything was going that way. And what we were observing, we in the executive committee and others, was, of course, about Cuba, was the United States thought that if they were able to reverse one country that they really hate, Cuba was the one. They thought they had it. They tried Venezuela, they failed, even though Venezuela went through hell. They tried Nicaragua, they failed, because the Nicaraguans defended themselves pretty well. But Cuba was really the possibility, and we were extremely worried. Until May 2024. In May 2024, the Cubans made an agreement with China. And the agreement with China is a bit bigger than what I'm going to describe, but the salient point of the agreement in May 2024 was that China was going to provide resources as well as technology, as well as technical expertise for Cuba to establish many solar panel farms to produce electricity. Cuba is the ideal place. So, they have sunshine more than anything else. And they were able to establish 55 solar farms already. And the plan is to increase that to 92 as quickly as possible, possibly in the next 2 years. And they will continue to expand solar farms. And at the moment, the total capacity of the solar farms in Cuba produce something like 2 megawatts, which is quite big, but it's not sufficient. Cuba needs much more. Nevertheless, the connection with China, and the Chinese donated Cuba 70 tons of material, implements, and so on, which, 70 tons is not small. So that's number one. Then in September 2024, Bruno Rodriguez, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, met with Wang Yi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. Wang Yi would be like number 2 in the hierarchy of China. I think it would be Xi Jinping and then Wang Yi, because he's the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They exchange, pleasantries and cooperation. They sign agreements and so on. And Wang Yi made the following point. He said they're totally committed. China is totally committed to safeguard Cuba's sovereignty under attack from the United States. They said exactly as I'm saying to you. So China is weighing in to make sure that uses its power, its resources, as much as it can at this stage politically, in order to ensure that Cuba doesn't go down. And this is a massive shot in the arm, if I can use that expression. And, then in January 2025, which I think is part of the same process, Cuba was accepted as an associate member of BRICS, the new international alternative multipolar collaboration outfit, which is basically BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they've been increasing, more countries. Cuba will become an associate member, not a full member. Nevertheless, it will have access to credit from the New Development Bank, which is run by the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who is very friendly. And then even more important than that, Cuba will have access to the BRIC export and import. And the BRICS have the characteristic that they don't necessarily use the dollar. If they can avoid it, they will avoid using the dollar. That means the following. Cuba, in other words, will not have to sell whatever it is in the world market to be able to obtain dollars, to be able to actually purchase stuff that the economy needs. It can do it through other currencies. Rupees is one of them. Rubles is another one. Yuan is another one. And this is the currencies that the BRICS actually trade in. China has arrangements of this kind with I don't know how many countries where the arrangements are done in local currencies, in national currency. That is to say, it's a huge alleviation financially, and Cuba will have access to technology, access to trading partners, access to resources, and then it doesn't have to get dollar, not as much as before. It doesn't mean to say it will resolve all the problems, but the potential of that development is going to be gigantic. So therefore, not only China is waning, but also has been Cuba has just joined this. And then in May 2025, that is to say, 1 month ago, Cuban President Diaz-Canel met Xi Jinping personally. And then Xi Jinping reiterated China's commitment to safeguard Cuba's national sovereignty that is under attack from the United States. I mean, you got it from the top, absolutely from the top. So this is really very, very good. In other words, Cuba is going to have to go through maybe 1 or 2 years of sort of duress because, things are not automatic. Nevertheless, there is alternatives that it already has available. And given the resilience and the capacity of the Cubans to resist, but also to be inventive and imaginative to sort things themselves out of things, is going to really help them quite dramatically. That is to say, it's very likely that by the end of this year, the possible collapse of Cuba, which may look like imminent, is going to be alleviated quite dramatically, which is, it's really peace of mind for everybody. And then come next year, we'll see what happens. But if things continue to develop, it's going to be much better. Now, one point of caution here. Things are not automatic. That is to say, the very fact that you join things, things do not come immediately. The main difficulty here, it seems to me, is that the structure of the Cuban economy and the productivity levels of the Cuban economy are not brilliant. And the Cubans know this. So they need to sort out. One of the things that the Chinese are helping the Cubans with, and they have a huge amount of experience, is to actually expand the agricultural sector as much as possible. Nobody knows more about producing food for millions and millions and millions and millions of people than China. So this is another shot in the arm. And I think the Cubans think that. I do not have the information as to exactly what the proposals are. How do you, let me put it as an economist, how do you actually restructure the agricultural sector in Cuba to make it significantly more productive? I got a few ideas, but I'm not sure this is what they're going to do. Nevertheless, one mechanism, which it is possible, is to technify the agricultural production rather than use the old-fashioned system, which is, peasants working the land literally daily, facing the horrible sunshine for long hours and getting up very early. If you technify, that is to say, with a significant amount of investment in machinery, then the number of workers that you need in order to significantly increase your productivity and your output is not much. And the investment is not very big. There is only one difficulty with that. And I'll leave it there because I don't want to complicate the picture and present too much. If you actually technify the cultural sector and make it very productive, you are going to produce abundance of product, and then the prices are going to come down quite dramatically. The population will be able to consume much more. However, by technifying the agricultural sector, you're going to release a huge amount of labor that is not going to be needed, and that will generate unemployment. So if you are in charge of the economy, this is the kind of things, and the plant economy, particularly the Cuban one, is things that you have to consider. So my point is, if Cuba is going to restructure itself to make itself more productive, some serious transformations are going to take place. Exactly how they're going to do it, I do not know. But I know that in their mind, the crucial, most important thing is that the revolution must survive. And from the point of view of the left, from the point of view of Venezuela, the left in Brazil, and so on, it is vital that the Cuban Revolution survive. Because if it didn't, the United States will occupy the space and it will use it as a platform to attack everybody else, as we know they will do. So it will set back the struggle for progressive politics, possibly 30 to 50 years. So Cuba cannot fall. It is in our interest in Latin America and in the rest of the world that Cuba survive. And it's got all the possibilities to survive, especially now that is adjusting itself to this new reality geopolitically in the world with China, the BRICS, and others. And I know that I trust the Cuban leadership because they are able to come out of the worst possible situations, really, really well. So far, so good. I'll leave it there. Any questions?
Thank you, Francisco. As ever, you've left us with optimism, which is wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Have we got a bit of time for questions?
I got questions. Yeah, I got time. Yeah, of course I am.
Okay. I want to know if they're going to invest in technology for agriculture, where are they going to get the oil for petrol to run the machinery?
Venezuela is the obvious source. When Chavez made the deal with Fidel regarding the medical program in Venezuela, the health program, by which the Cuba sent 20,000 doctors to Venezuela and was able to provide healthcare to 24 million people right away like that, in a population of 30 million, which is incredible. And as a consequence of the deal, Venezuela was giving Cuba 89,000 barrels of oil a day, which was pretty good. At the moment, because of the sanctions against Venezuela and because of the desire or the effort by the United States to make the oil economy and the oil industry collapse in Venezuela, which nearly succeeded, but they didn't succeed completely, but they really damaged it quite substantially. Venezuela, that used to produce 3.5 million barrels of oil a day, was down to 200,000. It's recovering now, and it's producing 1.2 million barrels a day. So the Venezuelan economy is growing at a rate of 6.28% per year, which is one of the highest in the region. And it's recovering massively. So with the recovery of Venezuela, then there is a possibility of the recovery of the oil industry. There is two other sources of energy for Cuba regarding technology. I mean, we're thinking about, vehicles. One is that they can be electric vehicles. And electric vehicles from China, of different kinds, they cost in the region a good car, 4 doors, SUV type, will cost you $10,000. A Tesla, which is similar, it will cost you $43,000. So, and if you obtain equipment through electric vehicles on the basis of credit through BRICS and whatever arrangement, so you can really do a serious investment in that sense. Then China has oil, and particularly, and this is very strong as well in Cuba, Russia has a huge amount of oil. And both of them, China and Russia, are heavily participating. I don't know how heavily, but very strongly committed to safeguarding Cuba's sovereignty. And Russia is definitely there, and Russia can give you any amount of oil you want, certainly gas. So at least three sources of energy which can be done. The problem, it seems to me, is how do you reorganize the land to produce something different with different techniques and with different arrangements? And I think that is a major transformation, which we'll see how it goes if it does. But definitely they can obtain what they need.
More optimism. Thank you so much, Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an idea, the cotton industry in China, which is gigantic, I mean, how can you supply cotton for cloth or yarn for the whole of the country, which they can? The cotton industry and the cotton agricultural sector in China is completely technified. There is robots. There's no workers there. So I'm not suggesting that Cubans are going to do that, but it can be done to the level which is unbelievably high level. I've seen films and documentaries of how the Chinese organize the agricultural sector, just incredible. And so, say 10% of that in Cuba, even less, would more than do it. And when it comes to the question of tourism, which is a bit more complicated, the type of tourists that are increasing in numbers coming to Cuba are Russian.
Oh.
And the main reason is the Russians are not allowed to go to many places now, these days. So Cuba is an ideal place. And so the numbers are increasing. Number one, they have, direct flights and so on. And then if they were able to get 1%, and I'm not exaggerating, 1% of the Chinese tourists that go out every year, the Cuban economy will be saved right away. The reason is the Chinese, the outgoing Chinese tourists that go to outside China every year is in the region of 198 million. And, and they go to Asia mainly. But if you get 1% of that, which would be gigantic, that would result. And they're really working hard, the two countries, to see how they can collaborate. And I suppose they can offer packages. You can come for 10 days, 12 days, special arrangement, God knows what it. So it is possible. And Cuba is very attractive. The trouble is the distance. But, Chinese are quite hard, tough people. They can take long marches.
Anybody else got some more questions for Francisco?
You're all right. No, you're not.
Where am I?
You mentioned that there's going to be a surplus of labour when industry is applied to agriculture. What plans then for all the unemployed Cubans? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, what they've done so far with the tourism industry, when they reduce the state expenditure as a result of the collapse of the USSR between 91 all the way to 97, 2000. What they did was they created what they call cuenta propistas, which is self-employed. And they gave licenses to, I think it's in the region of more than 150,000 people that were given, they were retired voluntarily before early retirement, put it that way. Loads of them, huge number of them. And many of them were given these licenses and they became self-employed. What they did, they provide the service for which they charge, which normally was done by the town hall, the local town hall. So let's say the way it works in Cuba is if you have a window that is broken, then you apply to your local, town hall, then you fill in forms in triplicate, and then you wait for somebody to come to sort it out for free. But because of the system and because of the complications, because of the efficiency and particularly the lack of resources, that might take 3 months, maybe 6 months for somebody to come and repair it. When the lock of your door stop working, you do the same. You go to the town hall, fill in the forms and wait for somebody to come. Sometimes they never do. So if you actually have self-employed and you say, how much is it? Give me a couple of dollars. And then you get the thing fixed right away. And there was plenty of these people that were very useful to the economy, and they were not expensive, and they were affordable, and many problems were resolved. So I imagine something like that could be done. To use that mechanism to absorb the unemployed. The level of unemployment in Cuba now, even though with all the problems, is 1.6%, which is extremely low. That is to say,
isn't it?
It is very low. Despite all the problems, Cuba ensures that all the people in Cuba, have some sort of income, some sort of employment, no matter how difficult it is. And they still have the libreta, that is to say, the food system that is given to people that get a minimum amount of goods that they can use sometimes every 2 weeks, sometimes every 3 weeks, sometimes every month, but at least it's a support for families. And depending on the structure of the family, the more members you have, the more members with special needs you have, then the more priority you have. So the most vulnerable are the best protected. And that includes, obviously, the question of unemployment.
We're running out of time, I'm afraid. We've got less than 1 minute.
Can we use it just to give a really huge thanks to Francisco?
Yes,
because
absolutely.
some of us, are flagging
Smile
slightly.
on our faces, which is
Yes,
wonderful.
you do put a smile on our faces
Yes.
because of the Cuban resilience, and we will do everything in our power locally to support, knowing that the survival of Cuba is so important for the survival of Latin America, and one in the eye for Trump, and